recognizing the behavior that you want to see from your team and then really publicly praising it. And the specific thing I've done is whenever I have engineers asking you like, hey, why are we even working on this? Sometimes it can be really frustrating because they will often not have the right context. And then it'll be like, oh my God, like I just want to ship this thing. And these people are asking questions. But thinking about that as like an extremely positive behavior of like, hey, here's someone in the organization who's like actually trying to dig in, being like, oh, like that's a great question. Like, thank you so much for asking.
I'm Pulkit Agrawal, and this is the Product Lunchbox, the bite-sized series for product people. In less time than it takes for you to eat lunch, we'll share some distilled insights and tactics from an experienced product operator on a single topic per episode. Today on Product Lunchbox, we're talking to Espen Scheuer, who's breaking the mold in healthcare product management. Espen works at NextHealth, which builds flexible tools and infrastructure for doctors, including products around scheduling, communications, forms, payments, and more. As head of patient experience, Espen has restructured his team around a product-assisted model, and that challenges top-down decision-making that most PMs rely on. Espen, really glad to have you on this and to be talking about should the PM be the CEO of the product, which is a term I've certainly heard before, and I think can be appealing to people who want to be like the CEO, and it's like, oh wait, product management is a great way because I get to be the CEO of a product, but that's maybe not the most efficient way to do it, maybe not the most empowering way to do it. So maybe give us a quick debrief of what's the other way to do it.
So I think the other way to run teams is something that I first heard from Shreyas as this distinction between product-led and product-guided teams. A product-led team is going to be similar to, the PM as the CEO of the product. You're making a lot of decisions. You're really being prescriptive around what the solution looks like to a lot of the engineers and the designers that you work with. And then product-guided teams are more like PM as the guide to kind of build up their team, build up their organization to maybe make the right decision for the customer, solve problems, but with the assumption that, you are not this single node that is making all of the important decisions, this single person who is driving all of the solutioning. So that's really the distinction.
Got it. So you're maybe less of a top-down hierarchical executive, but does that mean it's like decisions by committees? Like, are you trying to get unanimous decision-making? How does it actually operate?
Yeah, I think it's really important to have, I think about the different phases of the product process. Like in problem definition, like that's where the PM is that single decision maker, right? Is this a problem we should pursue? What are the details of the problem? And then as you get into like the design and the solution design, that's where kind of the designer does become that real decision. I think it's not about moving to decision by committee, but really about just ensuring that all of the members of the team have enough to input and weigh in and have opinions and really care. Because I think you see a lot of the really negative outcomes you see when PMs are driving the bulk of decisions and making the bulk of them by themselves are just engineers and designers who are like, hey, like my job is just to, make UIs, or my job is to just implement Jira tickets. And then you're like, why aren't you thinking about the customer? And they're like, well, I've never been put in a place where I should think about the customer. And I think, yeah, so I think there's definitely a fine line there. I think there's probably some interesting overlap with like founder mode or making more decisions top down. But I really think it's just about setting up the people in your organization to all be able to provide good input, even if there is still that, single decision maker in the PM, in problem definition, and in, maybe the designer and the engineer as you get further into implementation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it, because sidesteps the issue of like, does everyone have to be involved in every decision, which can be super inefficient, but it's not that. It's about like giving more ownership to different folks in the product team based on their skills. And like you said, it means instead of a designer focusing purely on like the design and the interaction and the visuals in the context of Figma, they're doing it in the context of the problem and the product. So I love that. And I'd love to press on the founder mode thing though. Are there still pieces where you feel like, okay, you need to like zoom in and like do something, or you take strong ownership of something that otherwise you wouldn't have?
I think, yeah, when my interpretation of founder mode, and you might honestly be able to speak better to this being a founder yourself, but it is really just, it's about asking leaders to be in the details of the things that their teams are doing. And I interpreted it as being to hold up that quality bar. So like, I don't think any of what I'm saying is an excuse for PMs to be like, oh, I'm not even looking at the designs, right? I spend a ton of time looking at every single spec my team is outputting, every single design they're outputting, and really thinking like, is this the best possible solution to the problem that we're solving? So I almost think it's like a separate thing where like, I want everyone on the team to have their own opinions about what good is, but it doesn't excuse leaders from being like, oh yeah, I'm just completely delegating to my team to deliver this solution, right? I think still the expectation that I have for any PM on my team, for myself, is that we're extremely in the details and we're thinking deeply about like, okay, is this the best possible thing that we could deliver all the way end to end? So yeah,
Yeah.
that's kind of how I thought about it.
Yeah. And I think like the founder mode thing is it's it can be dangerous as well as powerful because I think it can excuse some bad founder behaviors. And so I've been thinking about like, hey, where is it where it's actually unproductive, and where is it that? And I think setting the quality bar high is probably my most important job as a founder. So instead of kind of just parachuting into a random design, kind of think of it like, okay, I am very clearly going to join some design syncs. It's going to be very clear
Yeah.
to the team I'm going to be joining them. And so, but I'm not joining every single design sync, and I'm not joining every single product meeting. So there's plenty of
Yeah.
work happening outside, but there'll be cases where we'll be like looking at specific interaction designs of like, and then I'll be challenging or questioning or learning how to try and figure that out. So maybe that's like
Yeah.
how does it work for you? How does it manifest? What's the
Yeah,
implementation
I'd
for you?
love to. I'd love to get a little bit, because that's kind of how I think about. I think every leader in my organization's job is like pushing the quality bar as high as you possibly can. I'm curious tactically how you've gone about identifying where and when you do intervene and look deeper. Because I think that's probably the hardest part, because it's like it can be everywhere, it can be nowhere, but it's hard to, I think, for the team to operate if they don't know.
Yeah, I mean, in the product context, some of it comes with looking at the designs. I think the designs is like it brings so much of the thinking together. I think where if I would double click or go further is where I see that there's decisions made that don't have a good foundation or feel like there's based on some, maybe the data isn't fully like we're not convinced about something. And so then
Yeah.
when you kind of see a crack, then it's like, okay, let's prise this open and try to understand, well, how do we get here? Why is this? Or if we
Yeah.
see a design decision being made that sits outside of a design principle. It's like, okay, well, we're
Yeah.
making an exception here. What's going on? Why is there an exception? Can't we make
Yeah.
it part of the design principle? So I feel like
Yeah.
I look for like those cracks and then push further and ultimately hopefully lead to a better shared understanding of what is a principle, such that this crack doesn't appear in a future design. And then I do like closing the loop around watching the review. Like we have a interesting thing at Camino where everyone records a show and tell at the end of the week for 5
Totally.
minutes, and then I watch pretty much all of them. So I
Yeah.
spend multiple hours a week watching everyone's, and that's like, it's not just my reports, it's like everyone's show and tell. And then that way you get to see exactly what was happening. And then I can leave a few comments here and there. And that typically, creates some discussion or some kind of feedback.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think the two frameworks that have been really helpful for me there are obviously like the Jeff Bezos closed door, open door decision thing, where it's like, okay, is this a decision, that we could come back and undo in the future? And then also just thinking about my own level of disagreement with the decision. So I'll often try to be like, oh, I'm like 50-50 on this, or I'm 55-45, or I'm 70-30. And being mindful where like with my design counterpart, like if I'm 60-40 or even 70-30, where I'm like, I don't know, I'll be like, okay, hey, this is a decision that ultimately you were brought into this organization to make. And so that's kind of how I try to think about it. But I think it's a tricky one.
What like, maybe you can tell some, if someone wants to kind of adjust their motion of how they run product teams, can you give us some like tactical things that you do
Totally.
well, or like how should they go about, adjusting themselves?
Yeah, I gotta point to two things. Shreyas has some great videos on this, and also there's a Lenny's podcast with Tower Vive where he talks tactically. And some of the tips I'm about to repeat, I got from that one. It's called Becoming a Super IC. I think it has some great stuff in there. But the three things that I've really been thinking about are one, it sounds really obvious, but recognizing the behavior that you want to see from your team and then really publicly praising it. And the specific thing I've done is whenever I think often as a PM, you might have engineers asking you like, hey, why are we even working on this? Or like, won't this not be the right thing for the customer? Or won't this design, isn't this not quite right? And sometimes it can be really frustrating because they will often not have the right context. And then it'll be like, oh my God, like I just want to ship this thing. And these people are asking questions. But thinking about that as like an extremely positive behavior of like, hey, here's someone in the organization who's like actually trying to dig into like, why are we doing what we're doing? And really both praising it directly to them, calling it out to the team, and just being like, oh, like, that's a great question. Like, thank you so much for asking about that. Right. So really just making sure to like recognize the behavior we want to see from the team. And when engineers or designers are like stepping in to what might traditionally be like the product manager's role, just being like, hey, like, thank you so much for asking. Like that's a great question. Like, and really encouraging that discussion, in a public place, which kind of gets to my second tactical tip, which is taking a lot of the conversations that I used to have with the PMs on my team about like, here's what we're doing, here's what we should be doing, here's what solutions we should be doing, and just moving that to channels where the engineers and the designers on the team can see it. And so tactically, what that's meant is I've actually changed my one-on-one cadence. So I have much fewer one-on-ones with PMs on my team because I know everyone's like, oh, don't do status updates, don't do project work in one-on-ones. But realistically, if I have weekly one-on-ones with someone, like we're not going to talk career development and coaching and feedback every single week. And so we get into a lot of like, okay, what are you working on? How are you thinking about it? And so what I've done is I've moved a lot of those conversations to this meeting cadence that we have now every Monday called 3-on-3s, where it's the engineer, my engineering counterpart and my design counterpart, right? So our head of engineering, our head of design, meeting with the PM and designer on each of our teams, and then doing a lot of that project level discussion in that meeting so that everyone is inherently kind of bought in on some of the context. And then similarly having like Slack channels for each of those pairings, where now instead of like slacking a PM, like, oh, about this project you're working on, like, have you thought about this, this, and this? I'm just putting that in that public channel. So moving a lot of that discussion into a channel where engineers and designers are more easily able to contribute. And then the last one is also, I think, somewhat obvious, but just doing my best to find ways to bring customer context in a summarized way to the engineering team. So now we've always had like kind of bi-weekly sprint meetings and reviews. And now we have customer clips in every single one of those, and just being like, hey, here's a specific like conversation that one of the PMs had or some feedback that we got. And this is, what we thought about it or how it informed some other work. So yeah, I think those are the tactical things that I've done, and so far they've been working really well. Gotten some really positive feedback, but definitely still trying to find more ways to like. I think that the big area I'm thinking about next is how you like bring engineers further into the design and product process, like moving them left, so to speak, which I think can be tricky. But
okay, so I love those. So let's recap. So number one is encouraging the behaviors of asking questions or leaning in, because often people are kind of nervous about stepping outside of their lane. And especially if they're not familiar with it. So if we want to have them start to take on more responsibility, then that's a really great way to encourage that behavior. So that's awesome. The second way was this 3-on-3 meeting, essentially including your design and engineering counterpart in the discussion about a feature with the IC or the PM lead and engineer and designer. So that,
and I think we do that in two ways, which is one, this like kind of weekly thing, and then also dedicated working sessions on like a specific project that are scheduled on a more ad hoc basis. But I do think the key thing there is it's not just another meeting. And so being very deliberate that I did reduce the frequency of one-on-ones, adjust some of the other team meetings. And so I was able to go to the team and say, hey, this is our new process. As a result, you will actually have less meeting time because we're going to be meeting one-on-one less frequently. We're going to change our team meeting in this way. That was pretty key there, I think.
And do you worry? And and then there's the public channels. And curious about that. Do you feel like that adds to noise? Like, how do you keep signal to noise ratio high? Or is everyone now having to take three people's inputs into their job?
I think it's really just being mindful in those things, and I think most of the communication that was happening like directly between me and the PM on my team, what I noticed was like I would talk to a PM on my team about some project work, right? And say, like, maybe instead of approaching, this project in this way, we should do this instead. And then they would also have one-on-ones with their EMs and with their design counterparts where they would talk about similar things. And so we were kind of playing this weird game of telephone. I think the decision that we have made there is to not include the entire, like IC engineering team. We'll have typically, one PM, one EM, one designer for like 6 to 8 engineers. So just being mindful there, like trusting the engineering managers to think about communicating out to their teams. And that's something I might change my mind on in the future. But generally my observation was like, I would tell my PM something and then they would go tell their engineers and designers something. And so it's like, okay, we should probably just centralize this communication and discussion in one channel. You like reduce miscommunication, you reduce duplicate conversations. So that's kind of how I thought about it. But definitely something I'm mindful of.
Yeah, we're a big fan of public channels at Chameleon. We really discourage any DMing around work topics. So that, because you often find you need to pull someone else in, or you need to give someone context and to summarize it, and it gets really difficult with DMs. And then the way that we try to reduce people's noise is to say, hey, don't have all your Slack notifications off unless someone's mentioned you specifically, so that you can kind of go and pull data whenever you're ready to go into Slack, rather than getting pushed to you when you're not ready to switch context. I'm curious, from all of these changes that you've made, do you feel like you've seen impact? Is it belief like this is just better, or have you seen like, hey, empirical evidence of this is a better way to approach things?
Yeah, I think the reason that I would say we're fairly early in it. I think the things that gave me immediate confidence were like just immediate positive feedback. Like even one weekend, I've never added a meeting to folks' calendar and have so many people be like, "Oh man, this is so much better." So just like was immediate validation for my team and even and from the engineers and designers that like, "Oh hey, I used to have all these meetings, like, or all these conversations one on one, and now we're like having this one on one, even from folks who were skeptical, which was particularly cool. I remember I had one engineering manager who was like, I don't know if this is like the right thing, or like, why are you putting another meeting on my calendar? And then we had like two of them. And the next week he was like, man, this 3-on-3 thing, like, I just feel like I know what's going on in my team. And then I think we're starting to see, right, like that increase in quality, that decrease in like, I hear one thing from an engineer on the team and I hear one thing from the designer on the team. And I'm like, wait, I think I said something kind of different for both of those things to the PM on your team. And then also, I think one of the big reasons I was so opinionated on having it reduce overall meeting load was that even if it's like equivalent, I have still eliminated, I think, like 30 minutes of meetings a week from my PM's calendars. I was like, okay, that's like worst case, we just have one less meeting and it's equally as effective. But I think I'm just from like having folks, I think one of the PMs, the high water mark for me was one of the PMs on my team just came to me the week after and was like, I'm 100%, if I ever go work anywhere else, like I'm 100% taking this with me because it's like, it's just such a great change. So
That's
just,
awesome.
yeah, I think,
Yeah, what amazing
yeah,
validation.
yeah, I was like, again, never added a meeting and have had people be like, oh, wow, this is like
Yeah.
actually useful.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, well, hopefully this is going to inspire a lot of people to like switch it up or like learn more, read more. You already dropped a few resources.
Yeah, I think the big thing is just thinking about what you're talking about in your one-on-ones and like the appropriate frequency. I think a lot of people have like come up in environments where like everyone's manager has like weekly one-on-ones, then maybe they have weekly one-on-ones with all their stakeholders, and just thinking about like, is that the right way to work? Like, what are you talking about in those meetings, and should that be moving? I feel like it's the equivalent of a DM in meeting
Yeah,
form.
and even worse probably.
Takes longer than a DM.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's wrap up. And I've got a couple of quick fire questions for you, which, you're clearly well read, well researched. What are your like good go-to resources? What do you recommend that other product people go to learn more?
Well, I appreciate it. I'm always trying to be more well read, but I think I have kind of two categories of things that I like to consume about product. In the much smaller categories, like explicit like frameworks or explicit like people talking about product work. And I think really I go to like Lenny's podcast and Treyas are just both I found to be really high quality. And I really use those as like things to help me think about the things that I'm doing differently, right? So hearing other people talk about this is how I do product work and then being like, okay, how do I think about that? And it's not always, I often feel like a lot of that advice can be not the right for the stage you're at or the company that you're at. And so just like kind of consuming that. But then by far and ahead, the thing I consume the most is just like stories about other startups. And so I look to like my two favorite right now are I think 20VC has some good stories there. And then Turner Novak's The Peel also has some really, I just like, he's very like open and honest conversations with founders about the problems they're having. And I think like that is my favorite category of media because it's just like, hey, you hear about like, here's how I thought about this specific problem. And the more granular, the better. I think the more specific to like, this is what the specific problem I had. This is specifically how I solved it, the better. So that's, I've been e-biking around a lot in the city. And so I have a lot of time to listen to podcasts. I've been doing that a lot.
That's awesome. Well, that's part of the goal for this product lunchbox series is to have like short 10 to 15 minute episodes on a specific topic so people can get into it. So that's awesome. And then lastly, what about any tools that you're in love with right now, you love using a lot? Any recommendations?
I think I was thinking about this one, and I think like it's a lot of basic stuff. I've recently like revamped the whole way my team tracks specs and products in Notion, and that's been just like game changing. But the one specific thing that I have is because I listen to so much content, I'm a big fan of 2x speed. And so I have this Chrome extension called Global Speed that just like any video content that I play on any site is at 2x speed, which has been really nice to not have to like click around and find like, how do I speed this up? And I specifically love it for a lot of customer calls where I listen to a lot of like onboarding and support calls, and being able to like absorb that information faster has been pretty nice for me. So big fan of Global Speed right now. Yeah.
Anyway, okay, well, that's awesome. Thanks, Espen.